Okay, hello everyone who's listening. Looking at Mrs. Dalloway. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail because, once again, these will probably be long enough as they are. So this is just to sort of help you get started and thinking about the text. You should go through your own process of carefully looking at everything and finding out what's there and finding out what you can write about. This is all about exam preparation because certainly after the exam last year, I looked back at the podcasts and the extracts that were chosen I had specifically discussed on some of the podcasts. We might get some issues with the fact that you guys have got different page numbers to what I have, so I won't actually mention page numbers. I'll just talk about like the paragraphs and stuff like that. So starting on the very first page, obviously opens with the short line, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. As some people have said, we could read this as a kind of challenge to the social hierarchy that Clarissa is going out to do this sort of menial task and not asking the help. The next paragraph, a lot has been said about the discussion here of the doors being taken off their hinges. There are two ways this has been interpreted. Some have said that it suggests that certain characters are unhinged, so it's making a symbolic comment about their psychologies. The interpretation that I prefer is that it symbolises this idea of opening up the inner self and revealing our inner worlds. As we know throughout this book, the inner worlds of the characters are revealed. Often just to us as readers, but sometimes to one another, as in one character reveals his or her inner self to another character, and it ties in with this key concern of the conflicting desires for communication with others, but also the need for privacy of the inner self. The passage that begins, "What a lark, what a plunge," it does foreshadow Septimus's suicide in the sense that we have Clarissa plunging out through windows as Septimus does at the end. We also have the use of the word wave there a couple of times, so repetition of the word wave, which in that sense the language itself takes on a wave-like quality through the use of repetition. The most interesting thing I think though in that, well, actually not the most interesting, but one interesting thing in that paragraph is you'll notice there are a number of instances where there are short statements either following or surrounded by hyphens. So this part here where it's Peter Walsh said, musing among the vegetables, was that it? And again in the same sentence she repeats, was that it? Later on at the end of that paragraph, how strange it was. And at the beginning of a couple of paragraphs down, you've got how many years now with a question mark. And this is part of the free indirect discourse and stream of consciousness writing that Woolf has employed, as this kind of constant self-questioning acts as a mirror to what real thought is like. We don't think with total confidence and clarity. We're often stopping and second-guessing and analysing and reconsidering. And that's part of this modernist experimental writing that Woolf employs. We also have a description of Clarissa looking like a bird at this early point. Let me see. Over the, well actually I shouldn't say over the page, but the paragraph beginning, for having lived in Westminster, how many years now? Over 20. There's some interesting stuff in that paragraph, particularly the references to Big Ben. We have the word boomed used to describe the clock striking, and boomed you could argue is quite a word with negative connotations, also military connotations. We can think of bombs and stuff like that. We're told that the leaden circles dissolved in the air. Lead at that time was commonly recognised, as it is now, I guess, as a poison. And this idea of it dissolving in the air When you think of the word dissolve, you think of perhaps a poison or a tablet or something dissolving in water. So we have a lot of mortality references here. Even when we're told then the hour, irrevocable meaning you can't take it back. So the word irrevocable very much associated with this idea of death, mortality, etc. Yeah, that's right. Sorry, just struggling to read my own handwriting. Immediately after that, important quote which we've discussed in class, where Woolf writes, "For heaven only knows why one loves it so, how one sees it so, making it up, building it around one, tumbling it, creating it every moment afresh." What that is, that sounds very confusing, but it's a reference to the way that we create our own realities. So we don't just passively experience the world, we contribute to, constructing understandings of reality, interpreting things, making decisions about people, for example, if we like them or not, etc., etc., etc. There is no one world that everyone experiences exactly the same. We all experience slightly different worlds through different interpretations, and to some extent we create our own worlds. And this is what's being described here, making it up, building it around one, so it's something that we're constructing. Going down to the paragraph that begins, "For it was the middle of June. The war was over, except yada, 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 yada." There are a lot of references in that paragraph to kind of the trappings of Britain and the things that are representative of the of England and the social structure. So references to the king and queen, the palace, lords, ascot, so cricket bats. In the previous paragraph, there was a reference to Acts of Parliament. So we're getting all these symbols that represent the history and tradition of England. And it's interesting if you look, let's say if we read from "The King and Queen were at the palace," you'll see that, I'm pretty sure from memory, there are some quite long sentences there, and it says, "And everywhere that was still so early, there was a beating, a stirring of galloping ponies, tappings of cricket bats, Lords, Scott, Ranelagh, and all the rest of it, wrapped the soft mesh of the grey," and there's the word grey, "blue morning air, which as the day wore on would unwind them and set," etc., etc. As you can see, this is an extremely long sentence. And I think it's important with passage analysis, if you see really long sentences like this, not just to ignore them, but to try to make some kind of comment about what they might mean, because they exist throughout the text. You could explain how it ties in with this stream of consciousness writing. So it could be, a representation of how thought works. Sometimes it's a very long stream of things, sort of thing after thing or idea after idea. You could also say that perhaps Woolf is writing here to attempt to convey the overwhelming nature of all these things that Clarissa is seeing by putting them in one long sentence. So it's almost like she's being bombarded by all these impressions and all these images that she sees. And that continues on. In the same paragraph, there's actually a part where there is some repeated use of semicolons near the end of that same paragraph, where it says, "But how strange on entering the park, the silence semicolon, the mist semicolon, the hum semicolon, the slow swimming happy ducks semicolon," etc. And it's kind of like what we might describe as impressionistic writing, where we're getting all these short, sharp images that give us an impression of this place where the character is located at the moment. It also lends, I think, that wave-like rhythm to the writing that Clarissa, who am I talking about, that Virginia Woolf is so famous for, and that this text is famous for. Let me see. Also in that paragraph, there's a very short quote there where Clarissa refers to being part of it. And she's referring to part of just the experience of life here. And this is kind of the reason for her holding the party, is just experiencing life and bringing all these people together. Hugh Whitbread shows up at this point. He says, "Good morning to you, Clarissa. Where are you off to?" And interestingly, her reply is, "I love walking in London. Really, it's better than walking in the country." It's interesting to note that she's actually not answered his question at all. So he's said one thing, and she's, I guess, kind of answered it, but not really. And this happens a few times in this text. How do we interpret that? It's certainly, perhaps, given that this is a book that explores subjective experience and inner worlds versus outer worlds, it might suggest a lack of communication between these two. He's asking one question, she answers a different question, but he actually doesn't even seem to register this. Let me see. Over my page, we get Clarissa starting to reflect at this point on some of the things that Peter Walsh thinks about Hugh Whitbread. Walsh doesn't like him at all, sees him as kind of a representation of, again, the English gentleman. But this isn't something, well, it may be something that Clarissa agrees with, but she doesn't dislike Hugh Whitbread, and she in fact comments here that, well, that's Peter at his worst. Now, hopefully you're not getting too lost here in terms of what paragraph we're up to, but I guess you can always pause it. After that, there is a paragraph. It should be easy to find because the whole paragraph is in brackets, and it begins with June had drawn out every leaf on the trees. And basically what we just get is there's use of the word waves there as well, but interestingly it sort of pauses the narrative briefly to make some comments about various things. So we've got a description of the street, we've got some comments about Clarissa herself. But I think it's really important to look out for these sections that are in brackets. Brackets, the correct term for a bracket is, well, for plural brackets is parentheses. And the way I would describe these examples are as, and this is up on the wall in the literature room if you have a look, is parenthetical digressions. It's quite a complex term, but you will impress examiners, I believe, if you use that term. And you can comment on, well, why might Woolf have put this parenthetical digression here? What does it achieve? Well, certainly it, once again, mirrors the way thought works, because sometimes we pause our thinking momentarily to think about something completely different. And it also allows Woolf to build on the scene by giving us a description of the physical environment when we haven't really had much of a description of the physical environment for a while. So it helps again to put the reader in this place where these events are playing themselves out. Let me see. So immediately after that, paragraph beginning, "For they might be parted for hundreds of years, she and Peter." For they might be parted for hundreds of years. Oh, sorry, I thought I'd misread that. So she starts thinking about Peter again. We get more comments about Peter further down, and near the end of that paragraph it says, "It was the state of the world that interested him, Wagner, or Wagner, Pope's poetry, people's characters eternally." And this is where we see that Peter is one of these characters that in some ways Woolf celebrates, because he's interested in poetry, he's interested in music, and it shows that he, to a degree, is an emotional person. He's not one of these cold, clinical people like arguably Richard Dalloway and some of the doctors. But we can't look at him that simply, because of course we know he's a paradoxical figure, because later on he seems to really love some of the elements of English society. For instance, much later on, we'll talk about this later, when the ambulance goes past. And we get the little quote here that he comments, and really hurts Clarissa in the past, when he says that, you know, she'll probably marry a prime minister and be the perfect hostess, because that, we know that the book is a critique of England's social structure and the social system, which is hierarchical, patriarchal and oppressive. And by Peter saying that, he's basically saying, oh, you're just going to join that social structure that we're kind of against. The next paragraph, Clarissa says that the marriage would never work between the two of them, even though she regrets at some moments not marrying him. And the reason for that is that with Peter, we're told, with Peter, everything had to be shared, everything had to be gone into, whereas Richard gives her space. And again, we come into contact with this key theme of these conflicting desires for communication with others, but also the need for privacy of that authentic inner self. And Clarissa feels that she doesn't get that privacy of the inner self from Peter, because he wants to delve into everything. He wants to go into everything, and it's intolerable for her. So this is an interesting one, I guess, from the romantic perspective, that Clarissa does have this really emotional, personal connection with Peter Walsh. She's able to reveal her inner world to him, and he is to her. This symbolic idea, well, it's represented symbolically in the book with like blinds flapping and doors taken off their hinges, etc. But in some ways that's a bad thing for her. So she ends up with Richard, who perhaps she's less passionate about and less able to engage with less emotionally. We see that later when Richard can't tell her that he loves her. But she sort of needs that privacy as well. So it's kind of this problem for her. Then we get after that, there's a very short paragraph. It's only 2 sentences that says she'd reached the park gates. She stood for a moment looking at the omnibuses of Piccadilly. That's why we call buses, because they used to be called omnibuses. But the paragraph after that, we're told she would, and this is how the paragraph begins, she would not say of anyone in the world now that they were this or that, or were that rather. And at the end of the paragraph, we sort of get that again, where she says she would not say of Peter, she would not say of herself, I am this, I am that. And she's referring to this idea that, and we can all relate to this, I think that people get pigeonholed. We want to say, person X, we can summarize them in a sentence. This is who they are. You know, they're arrogant or they're whatever. Clarissa Dalloway is here arguing, and Virginia Woolf through Clarissa Dalloway, that people are far more complex than that. People are made up of a multitude of sort of elements of their personality and contradictions and confusions, and their past influences them, and then the present influences them. What they hope for in the future influences them. They might behave one way with one person and another way with another person. We can't look at people as being simple. And I think that's also quite a modernist way of looking at the world, because the modernists sort of thought it's very, the world, for example, it's very difficult to understand the world in a really broad sense, because the world was made up of so many tiny parts. We need to try to understand perhaps those individual parts like a mosaic, and that gives us the bigger picture. And in some ways, again, this is what Clarissa's doing with her party. She's bringing all these people together, all these separate parts together in one place. And there's lots of references in this book to bringing stuff together. She begins the next paragraph by saying that she's good at knowing people by instinct. Whether or not you agree with that, that's for you to decide. And we might... here we go. Hang on. Paragraph beginning, her only gift was knowing people almost by instinct. About halfway through, she says, did it matter then, she asked herself, walking towards Bond Street, did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? All this must go on without her. Did she resent it, or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely? So she spends a lot of time thinking about death. So there's this ever-present awareness of her own mortality. And I think the second half of that paragraph, we get this really complex kind of discussion, which I might read in full, where she says, but that somehow in the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things, here, there, she survived, Peter survived, lived in each other, she being part, she was positive, of the trees at home, of the house there, ugly, rambling, all to bits and pieces as it was. part of people she had never met, being laid out like a mist between the people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches as she'd seen the trees lift the mist. But it spread ever so far her life herself. But what was she dreaming as she looked? And then she looks into the window. So this really quite bizarre, I think, description of something. And I think it's a really philosophical reference to how Clarissa understands existence. This idea that we're all linked, we're all connected, and perhaps not only are we linked and connected to other people, but we're linked and connected to the environments in which we operate. And perhaps if that's true, when we die, perhaps we don't die, perhaps we go on in some form. And I mean, you can look at it in a really simplistic way, like, well, in the memories of those who knew us, or you can look at it in, I guess, almost a spiritual, philosophical sense of this being a really complex idea that in many ways can't be expressed in writing. Something very, struggling for the word here. I think esoteric, ESOTERIC. I think even I'll have to look that one up, but I think it's a reference to kind of spiritualism and spirituality and stuff like that. Strange stuff being written here, but interesting nonetheless. Goes on to a Shakespearean quote here: "Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages," which reference to, well, when you die, you don't have to worry about that stuff. What will we skip ahead to? The paragraph beginning, there were Joric's jaunts and jollities. She's looking at the books. There's some reference in that paragraph to the fact that Clarissa has a desire to please people. We have a little parenthetical digression in there when the policeman puts his hand up. Then we go on to the paragraph which begins, "She would have been in the first place dark like Lady Bexborough." Interesting comment here where it says interested in politics like a man. So we get this reference to feminism showing through, this idea that, well, hang on, is it the domain of a man to be involved in politics? Couldn't a female be involved in politics? What the hell have I written here? Oh, victim. I thought it said victor. The bottom of that paragraph ends, "She had the oddest sense of being herself invisible, unseen, unknown. There being no more marrying," because she's already done it, "no more having of children now," she's already had a kid, "but only this astonishing and rather solemn progress with the rest of them up Bond Street. This being Mrs. Dalloway, not even Clarissa anymore. This being Mrs. Richard Dalloway." So it's almost like she's lost some of her identity there to her husband as a result of being married. And what I've actually written in the margin is that she's a victim of conversion, so by giving in a way. Next paragraph, Bond Street. Once again, we get this technique where all the semicolons are used. Bond Street fascinated her, semicolon. Bond Street early in the morning, in the season, semicolon. Then we get flags, semicolon, shops, semicolon, this, that, and the other thing. And again, rhythmic writing, but use of semicolons and very short statements, which is almost what we would call, as I said, an impressionistic writing style, where we're getting all these small impressions. Rather than spending half a page describing a whole street in detail, we just get a few quick impressions, and that can be very effective. "That is all," she said, looking at the fishmongers, "that is all." So she's talking to herself, as many people do in this book, but only Septimus is really judged very harshly. Okay, then we have a paragraph, not a straw, she thought, going up Bond Street to a shop where they kept flowers. Bit of a discussion of Elizabeth and Doris Kilman here. Kilman's name, people have interpreted that as being potentially significant, suggestive of death with a kill. I don't know, you could read it in a feminist way, I suppose. If you're interested in writing about that on the exam, maybe chat with me about it, because it's potentially a risky one. But the interesting thing here is that we get discussion of Elizabeth, discussion of Mrs. Kilman, and this reference to a kind of lesbian relationship, because Richard says, oh, it's a phase, that all girls go through. It might be falling in love, and then we're said, but why Miss Kilman? In other words, why would she fall in love with Miss Kilman? The use of the word phase here is interesting because it also perhaps implies that what happened with Clarissa and Sally Seton was just a phase. I think it was actually a lot more than that, though. Some interesting discussion of Doris Kilman here. You can read that and sort of go through it. I'm not going to go through it in real detail. But it is interesting that towards the end of the paragraph, a description of Kilman, which is kind of cool, which is that she's become one of those spectres with which one battles in the night. One of those spectres who stand astride us and suck up half our lifeblood, dominators and tyrants. Which I just think is an interesting way of describing this woman as a kind of monster, a supernatural being that's sucking the energy from Clarissa. And it creates quite an ominous tone, I think, and sort of makes Doris quite frightening in a way, even though it's certainly an exaggeration. Oh, maybe not certainly an exaggeration. But the next paragraph, when it says, it rasped her, though, to have stirring about, this brutal monster. People misread that and they think the monster being referred to is Doris Kilman. It's very confusing because Kilman is being described in a monstrous fashion, but the monster that's now being referred to in this paragraph is a different monster. It's the monster of hatred that Clarissa feels for Doris, and Clarissa is not comfortable feeling this hatred for another person. And here we see that trees for Virginia Woolf are symbolic of the human soul, because in the paragraph it says, it rasped her, though, to have stirring about in her this brutal monster, to hear twigs cracking and feel hooves planting down in the depths of that leaf-encumbered forest, the soul. So we're told that this forest is the soul. Never to be content quite or quite secure, for at any moment the brute, as in this hatred, would be stirring, this hatred she actually says, which especially since her illness had power to make her feel scraped hurt in her spine, gave her physical pain and made all pleasure in beauty and friendship, in being well, in being loved, yada yada yada. So the point is, tree symbolises the soul. This hate is something that exists within Clarissa's soul and she's not comfortable with it. Then, very short paragraph, nonsense, she cried to herself, pushing through the swing doors. I've put a big mark around the paragraph that begins, there were flowers, delphiniums, but I haven't written anything, so I'm going to have to try to remember. Yeah, this is the one where we get heaps and heaps and heaps of descriptions of flowers, almost, for most of the paragraph. Flowers, of course, symbolising femininity and emotion and joy and these sort of quite positive things, and by placing Clarissa in amongst the flowers here, it kind of creates a juxtaposition to this really dark, monstrous imagery that we've just come from. And it situates Clarissa as being similar to these flowers, because we're told that when she comes in, she was very light, tall, very upright. It is a description that's flower-like. At the end of that paragraph, where they talk about, or where Woolf talks about flowers heaps, at the very end, we're told how she loved the grey-white moths spinning in and out over the cherry pie, is it? Need glasses. Over the evening primroses. So the grey thing is always interesting when it pops up. But the colour grey here, it's only on these tiny moths that are flying around. So this oppression, this conversion, the negativity is very weak when compared with these the flowers, which symbolise emotion and stuff. Okay, then the car backfires. I don't know if I'll spend a huge amount of time talking about this section because we've talked about it in class. But certainly the car backfire is described as a violent explosion, which conjures sort of thoughts and images of the war. There's this grey car, ominous, powerful oppression, the social system. The male hand sort of pulls the blind down so we can't see. A bit of debate, is it the Prince of Wales or whatever? I'll skip over that down to when Septimus Warren Smith appears. We're told he's aged about 30, pale-faced, beak-nosed, so he looks like a bird, which makes him similar to Clarissa. Let me see what to talk about and what not to talk about. All right, so that paragraph, about halfway through, it says Septimus looked, and it says, boys on bicycles sprang off, traffic accumulated, and there the motor car stood with drawn blinds, and upon them a curious pattern like a tree. So this reference to the soul here. Septimus thought, so Septimus sees it as looking like a tree, it's in his perception. And this gradual drawing together of everything to one centre before his eyes. And again, we have this reference to drawing things together to try to understand them, which is similar to the party. But it comes very negative here because it says as if some horror had come almost to the surface and was about to burst into flames. Septimus's confusion is suggested as well at this moment by the self-questioning that he goes through. So was he not being looked at and pointed? Was he not weighted there, rooted to the pavement for a purpose? But for what purpose? So the questioning that's taking place. Poor Regia here, trying to deal with her husband. And then we have a paragraph which is some interesting use of repetition where it says, people must notice, people must see, people, she thought. 3 uses of the word people emphasize this sense of a crowd, that there are lots of people there, but emphasize also the concern that Lucrezia has, that lots of people are looking at Septimus and thinking, oh, look how weird he is. Don't use a word like weird. Abnormal might be a better one. So she kind of wants to hide him in the park at this stage. Short paragraph following that. She had a right to his arm, though it was without feeling. He would give her, who was so simple, so impulsive, only 24, without friends in England, who had left Italy for his sake, a piece of bone. So this these references to death here, very, very dark language, very dark tone. Let me see. Next paragraph you can look at closely, some quite dark language there. England, of the enduring symbol of the state, which will be known to curious antiquaries sifting the ruins of time, when London is a grass-grown path, and all those hurrying along the pavement this Wednesday morning are but bones with a few wedding rings mixed up in their dust and the gold stoppings of innumerable decayed teeth. The face of the motor car will then be known. So kind of imagining this distant future where everyone's dead and nothing matters anymore. Repeated use of the word queen in the short paragraph following that. It is probably the queen, the queen, the queen, the queen. Again, reveals people's fixation and Clarissa's fixation on this case. In this case, on that sort of stuff. We'll skip a paragraph and go down to the car had gone, but it had left a slight ripple which flowed through glove shops. So this this idea of sort of wave-like language and the motif of water and waves, which operates in a range of ways throughout the book. Either, well, actually, in this case, I would say we've talked about the waves and the drowning motif as people succumbing to the power of English society and conversion. That's how I'd interpret this part, because the car is a symbol of conversion, and it says that even though it's gone, it had left a slight ripple which flowed through. So it's like the power that it has to, I guess, wash over people. Yeah, lots more of that sort of stuff in that paragraph. Gliding across Piccadilly, the car turned down St James's Street. Tall men of robust physique, well-dressed, with their tailcoats, again, very symbolic of the patriarchy, these guys, these fit, well-fed, well-dressed men. a contrast to Septimus. And I'm going to skip a fair bit here, but it's interesting to note the way that all the people who are looking to see the Queen, well, we don't know it's the Queen, but whoever might be in the car, we're told that they're all poor people. So once again, we get this juxtaposition, and this is very much a critique of England's social system. This car, a symbol of wealth, these men walking past, well-fed, and by the way, the car sort of shuts the blind so people can't see in. And who should be milling about showing this interest in what's going on? It's all the poor people. And that emphasises the hierarchy that exists and how it's quite unfair to a lot of people. And in fact, the paragraph which begins, "So Sarah Bletchley said," about halfway down that, we get poor women, nice little children, orphans, widows, the war. So all these victims, you could argue, of what England represents, or perhaps not victims of what England represents, but they are the losers in this social system. So the war widows, they've lost their husbands because those husbands have gone off to fight for what England represents. And perhaps their husbands were fighting things that don't really benefit them much anyway. And we get the juxtaposition there of the bronze heroes being referenced. Lifted some flag flying in the British breast of Mrs. Bowie, etc., etc., etc. So then the aeroplane shows up. Suddenly Mrs. Coates looked up into the sky. Once again, we've talked about this a lot. Bored ominously. London got well and truly bombed to dust. Well, not that much, but it was really heavily bombed. So, and in fact, really, I mean, it was bombed a lot more severely in World War II. But anyway, it did get bombed in World War I. So the aeroplane ominously boring down. We're certainly thinking of war when we read that. Dropping dead down, that dark language. We have the baby lying stiff and white in Mrs. Coates's arms, very death-like. And at the end of that paragraph, it says, extraordinary silence and peace, which is also death-like. In this pallor, in this purity, bells struck 11 times. And we know the chiming of Big Ben is connected with mortality too. Let me see. All right, so skipping quite a few paragraphs down to a paragraph that begins, "So thought Septimus looking up. They are signalling to me." So this is obviously some very irrational thinking that he's going through. But the interesting thing in this section is that tears fill his eyes and he's crying about the beauty. And again, we've got lots of people talking to themselves, but we've also got people who break down crying. Later, Peter Walsh just suddenly breaks down crying. But at no point is he at any risk whatsoever of being sent away to the country or locked up or put into any form of care by someone like Dr. Bradshaw. Yet it's interesting, isn't it, that Peter Walsh just really is doing exactly what Septimus is doing here. We look at Septimus and we say, wow, this guy's nuts, but we don't really think the same thing when Peter Walsh cries. And the reason is, I would argue, that Peter Walsh is not a threat to England's social system. You know, he plays the game. He on some level, actually appreciates English society. Septimus is a threat to the system because he represents the most damaged members of the community as a result of the war and so on. And they want to get rid of him. They want to hide him. So a few more wave references following from that. We have the sky writing, which is interpreted differently by different people, which is very much about interpretation, of course. And there's a paragraph that begins, "But they beckoned, leaves were alive, trees were alive, and the leaves being connected by millions of fibres with his own body there on the seat, fanned it up and down." This is Septimus thinking. He's thinking very, very similar stuff to what Clarissa is thinking. these bizarre kind of spiritual, philosophical musings about trees and people and our connections with our environment. So again, connecting them, connecting Clarissa and Septimus, and Peter Walsh and Septimus are connected, as we'll see later on. Of course, we do have to acknowledge that Septimus is a bit more irrational than these other characters, outwardly irrational. Let me see. I've really got to speed this up. The paragraph that begins, "For she could stand it no longer," Dr. Holmes might say. Towards the end of that, Regia says, "Nothing could make her happy without him. Nothing." Yet previously she just said it would be better if he was dead. So she contradicts herself there, suggesting her confusion. Also, I really need to emphasise, just in case people are thinking this, just because I only talk about one sentence in a long paragraph doesn't mean that that's the only important part of the paragraph. There is heaps and heaps and heaps of important stuff in every single paragraph. I don't have the time to talk about it all. This is just sort of aimed at giving you a bit of a guide, and perhaps you can look back at these paragraphs and say, well, what has Mr. Murray missed that I can talk about in detail? Because if I talked about everything, it would be absurdly long. That said, it's good to have a text like that, because you know that your extracts that you get on the exam will all probably be good, because you can pretty much throw a dart at the page and whatever it hits, there's a good chance you'll have something there to talk about. The end of that paragraph, though, is a really good sentence, highly symbolic, where she says, we're told, would be a better way of putting it, her wedding ring slipped, she had grown so thin. Highly symbolic there, because it's suggesting that these traumas that she's going through are causing her to perhaps rethink her marriage, or are damaging her relationship with Septimus. So her wedding ring slipped, she had grown so thin. Very symbolic moment there, and quite cool, I think. She talks to herself as well when she says, "For you should see the Milan gardens," she said aloud. But to whom? The question's even asked. Who is she talking to? She's talking to herself, just like Septimus does, just like Clarissa does, just like Kilman does later. But it's only Septimus who's at risk of being locked up, because he is the threat to what England represents. There was nobody to talk to, we're told. Her words faded. That paragraph, again, there's interesting but complex description where it says, "Her words faded, so a rocket fades. Its sparks, having gazed their way into the night, surrender to it. Dark descends, pours over the outlines of houses and towers." You might be wondering what this is all about, this sort of extended metaphor of the, I shouldn't say firework, rocket. I think it, once again, is a reflection on mortality. This idea of darkness descending over us and swallowing us up. And you can read that in more detail and think about it and form your own opinion. Skipping ahead, paragraph that begins, "Men must not cut down trees." This is where Septimus is getting quite odd. "There is a God," we have brackets. "He noted such revelations on the backs of envelopes." What better place to write stuff? "Change the world. No one kills from hatred. Make it known." He wrote it down. "He waited. He listened." Really important to talk about how language is used in passage analysis. And I would say here that these short sentences suggest a kind of the strange, disjointed thinking that Septimus is going through. And you should look out for those sorts of things. Paragraph beginning, "There was his hand, there the dead. White things assembling behind the railings opposite, but he dared not look. Evans was behind the railings." I think it's interesting how we get this at the beginning. There was his hand, as in Septimus's, there the dead. So very much the living and the dead positioned side by side for, I guess emphasising in this case Septimus's fixation on mortality, just as other characters fixate on their own mortality, but perhaps showing that many of these people, although alive, are in a state of being near death, perhaps, either literally in Septimus's case because he dies at the end of the book, or like a metaphorical death resulting from conversion and loss of identity. And you can think of Bradshaw's wife as a really good example of that. Couple of paragraphs down, interrupted again. She was always interrupting. Lots of interruptions in this book for a range of reasons. I'll probably end up talking about that in more detail later, so I'll move on. Over the page, over my page. Really good section there where you see a whole heap of short paragraphs that begin with look. Like, look, she implored him. Look, she repeated, look. Look, 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 look. And this use of repetition emphasises Rege's desperation, her desperate attempts to get Septimus to see things the way that she sees them, or the way that, quote, normal people see them, to change his perception, because this is very much, again, about perceptions. But just by making him look at things, she's not going to achieve that. Really interesting. Following from that, we have this Maisie Johnson and Mrs. Dempster thing. I'm not going to talk about that in detail because we talked about it in class. Those two minor characters and what they represent, what they mean. If you want to talk about them more, by all means, come see me or raise it in class. One thing that is, I will mention though, is that Mrs. Dempster comments that she had no patience with women who were afraid of water, which I think is perhaps a reference to this idea of the drowning water of, succumbing and converting to England's social structure. And Miss Dempster thinks, perhaps symbolically, well, you just have to get married and do this and do that. Although she's a very cynical woman. I'm not going to ramble on about that. The aeroplane flies away, or it's kind of taking off. Okay, so a paragraph that begins then, while a seedy-looking nondescript man carrying a leather bag stood on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral and hesitated. That is all one sentence, that paragraph, I think. I'm pretty sure. That's what I've written anyway. I can't see a full stop. And we've got this weird kind of guy. He's looking at the plane. He's thinking about going into the church. He thinks, well, the cathedral offers company. Maybe he should enter. Later on in the same paragraph, why not enter? He thought. While he hesitated, out flew the aeroplane. Why this long sentence? Perhaps, it's this idea of free indirect discourse, stream of consciousness. This man, perhaps seedy-looking man carrying a leather bag. We don't know what his story is because we don't hear more about him, but perhaps he's in this inner turmoil that, should I go into the church? Should I embrace what the church represents? Perhaps it can save him from this seedy existence that he has. But it's an interesting one. And then a few more letters, T, O, and F, and it goes to the asterisk there, which I think is a good place to stop.